Good afternoon, everybody. This is Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA, and this is our May 22nd legislative update coming from a slightly less quiet Washington, D.C. We have normalcy trickling ever so cautiously back into Washington and many other parts of the country, and this is, I think, our first update since early March. Where we're going to spend almost as much time talking about non-COVID things as we're going to talk about COVID. But we'll start off, as we normally do, by looking at the economy. As I think we're all aware, the unemployment rate is not good. The official unemployment rate from the end of April, so this doesn't include May, is 14.7%, 14.4% based on another measuring of it. That represents the highest unemployment rate recorded in the United States since the U.S. government started paying attention. Now, the government started officially tracking unemployment in 1948, so that misses the Great Depression. But this is basically depression-level unemployment, and again, that's as of May 1st. And by all indications, the unemployment rate has gotten worse since then. Worth noting that the unemployment rate for computer and mathematical occupations is 4.3%, 4.7% based on another way of measuring it. Obviously much, much better than the overall economy. However, computer fields are typically more likely to be employed than the average American. And so that represents roughly an unemployment rate that's double the unemployment rate that we had about a year ago. Also, just to understand the statistic, Bureau of Labor Statistics releases the unemployment rate for certain segments of the economy every month. They're rough numbers. They move around a lot. So, 4.3% is a rough number. Computer and mathematical occupations includes all IEEE members in the computer fields. That category is almost exclusively computer. There aren't that many people employed in mathematical occupations. The problem is engineering, which is the other piece of IEEE, is plopped into the professionals category of the BLS report, and so it's hard to get a good number on that. We're working with BLS on some of the sub-data to try to get you a good number. But the bottom line is IEEE members are dramatically more likely to be employed than the average American at the moment, which you would expect, but is also good news, even though our unemployment rate is still not impressive. And I think a clue for what's going on in the economy can be seen in the graph on your screen. While the unemployment rate has spiked in the last month, the average wages paid to Americans has also spiked. And as you can see there, wage growth is off, not quite literally off the chart, but it's dramatically higher than it ever has been before. What appears to be happening is that most of the job loss in the economy is at the low end of the wage spectrum. So wages themselves aren't going up. We're just losing the bottom 10% of jobs, which makes the average wage go much higher. And that makes sense given the unemployment rate we're seeing for computer and mathematical fields. Overall, wages, overall people in the computer and mathematical occupations fields are not low wage workers and are less likely to lose their jobs generally and are dramatically less likely to lose their jobs in the current economic situation, although job loss is still substantial in our field. So moving on to kind of a general understanding of what's going on in the economy and in the country more specifically, University of Washington produced this very interesting map looking at the percentage of people who are wearing masks when they lose their home. And I love graphs like this, charts like this, because they allow us to start to recognize the diversity in the country, even between states that in theory should be very similar. You look at the map, there are some regional generalities we can make. The Northeast, they're wearing masks. That's not too surprising since New York was the hardest hit part of the country. New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Eastern Pennsylvania, also very hard hit. But when we move past that, there's some odd things that we notice. The Rocky Mountain states, for example, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, are wearing a lot of masks, which is a bit surprising given that they weren't hit very hard at all. And Those areas, there's a lot of distance between the people, low populations, lots of space. You look at states like Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Well, Oklahoma and Texas are very culturally and historically similar, and yet we see a dramatically different rate of mask wearing between the two states. Similarly, Oregon and Washington. Washington and California were both hit pretty hard. Oregon was hit significantly as well, and yet there's significantly less mask wearing in Oregon than there is in Washington State. You look at Wisconsin and Minnesota, two very culturally similar states, similar impacts from the coronavirus, and yet we have dramatically different rates of mask wearing. And so I find charts like this to be very interesting because it does remind us Americans in different parts of the country are responding dramatically differently to the current conditions. That's expected. That's normal. And as we move, a month, 2 months, 6 months, a year away from the immediate crisis, we can start to draw lessons about what worked and what didn't by looking at the natural experiment we have going on here between Wisconsin and Minnesota, between North and South Carolina, between Oregon and Washington State, Oklahoma and Texas, to start to draw some interesting conclusions about what works and what didn't. So the big news just before our last update was the HEROES Act, which has been introduced in the House. Last time we did this update, we were speculating about what kind of bill this was going to be. Was this a major legislative push, or was it a messaging bill? And what we've seen is that it's more of an opening bid. You may recall the CARES Act, which was the big relief bill that was passed back in March that we talked about extensively. That, as we discussed at the time, was a surprisingly simple piece of legislation. I mean, it was a big piece of legislation, but it wasn't that big, a couple hundred pages. And it was a relatively easy bill to read as far as these things go. Had just a couple big programs that were fairly simple and straightforward. And so you could read the bill and understand what it was doing. The HEROES Act is not that. The HEROES Act is a very complicated laundry list of programs that are getting additional funds from the bill, some of which are easy to understand, some of which are very hard to understand. It is increasingly looking like the Democrats are using this bill as their opening bid. They expect a negotiation with the Republicans in the Senate and the administration. So they threw everything into this bill and said, this is what we want, expecting it to be negotiated down in subsequent negotiations. So what we can start to tell now is which parts of that bill are just there for the campaign purposes or just there to make one legislator happy, and which parts of the bill are actually important because the Democrats plan to push them. We can also get a sense for what pieces of the bill are just non-starters and which one the Republicans are willing to negotiate over. And what we have are some provisions of the HEROES Act are kind of bubbling to the top as viable legislative proposals that might be in whatever the vehicle becomes next week, probably the week after that, as Congress starts to work on the next relief bill. The stimulus checks, the next round of stimulus checks in the HEROES Act, it's $1,200 per person up to 5 people. So you have a fourth child, they don't get anything, but the first 3 children do, for a maximum of $6,000. Republicans in the Senate have said that's too big, but they haven't said no. And so there is a chance for a smaller round of stimulus checks to go back out later this year. There is a PPP expansion and extension. PPP is the Paycheck Protection Program. That's the small business loan, which are really grants. That was the heart of the CARES Act. Very popular bill. And you might recall when we talked about it when the bill first passed, the purpose of the PPP, and in fact, the purpose of the CARES Act overall, was not to fix the economy. It was to allow the economy to survive to the end of May, at which point the expectation was the economy would start opening up and we wouldn't need more aid. Well, we're at the end of May almost, and the economy is starting to open up in some places, but it's still far more closed than most people expected in March. And so there's a provision in the HEROES Act that takes the PPP program that was designed to work till the end of May and extend it another couple months. Now, that date is likely to be negotiated. There are some changes to the program to broaden the number of organizations that can qualify for aid in the HEROES Act. Those will be negotiated, but it seems that most of Congress accepts that the PPP program will have to be expanded and extended in the next iteration of the bill. Big point of contention is the question of aid to state and local governments. Now, there was aid to state and local governments in the second and third COVID bills, but state and local governments have been hit pretty hard. A lot of their budgets weren't in great shape to start with. And so the Democrats in the House have proposed $1 trillion to go to state and local governments. And there's two issues there. One is the amount of money, and two is how it's distributed. The way the HEROES Act distributes it, it's a formula based on population and the impact of COVID on those states rather. So, for example, New York City will get more than Omaha. Seems reasonable. The Republicans have said the number is way the heck too big, but they generally haven't said no to state and local aid. Just, we're not going to do $1 trillion because we can't afford it, and because that takes care of a number of budget problems that have nothing to do with COVID. There's also some debate about the formula. The basic idea that states that have been affected by COVID the most will get more seems to be generally accepted, but the formula might be tweaked because the way the HEROES Act works, more money will go to Democratic states than Republican states. That's probably likely to continue, but maybe less more by the time we get a final bill. Lastly, there's the question of unemployment benefits. Previous relief bills had given an additional $600 on top of what an individual would get per week from the state for unemployment. That will run until end of the month, basically. Obviously, unemployment is not going to go away by the end of next week. So there's debate about extending that. The problem is there are examples and situations, particularly in the middle of the country, which is where Republicans tend to be from, where that extra $600 a week actually means people are getting paid more to not work than they would be paid to go back to work. And it's starting to become a problem in some of the states that are trying to open back up again. So Republicans want to reduce the $600 additional or get rid of it altogether, have a requirement that if an individual has been offered a job, they're no longer qualified for the bump up. So that's where the negotiation is. So the HEROES Act does not look like it's going to pass, but it is a useful negotiating point and debating tool to start the discussion about what the next relief bill will be. And the expectation is that the next relief bill will be about helping the country reopen and get back to work, as opposed to simply helping us survive. Interesting development in the House last week, or actually it was earlier this week. You may recall back in March, we talked a couple times about remote voting. The rule in Congress has been, since the country was founded, to vote, legislators have to be on the floor. They have to physically go to the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate and physically cast a vote. There's a little system with a card and it's electronic, but you got to be on the floor to make it work. When COVID started and the national shutdown began, there was a big debate about how Congress would function in this new environment. On the one hand, 240 whatever years of history says you have to be on the floor. On the other hand, a number of members of Congress came down with COVID and had to quarantine and thus were unable to vote. And let's face it, a sizable percentage of Congress are in the prime risk category, which is over the age of 60 or 70, depending on how you count, and thus probably shouldn't be in large crowds. In March, both the House and Senate leadership discussed this, and both of them said, no, there will be no remote voting. We don't want to go down that road. We think it's a bad idea. Since then, the Senate position has basically been the same. Voting has to be in person. The House, however, has changed their mind. And earlier this week, they passed a new rule that allows remote voting on legislation. just to clarify, this is not a law. In early January, every year after an election, so at the start of a Congress, both the House and Senate pass resolutions that set up the rules for how their chamber will operate. They're not laws. The other chamber doesn't approve them and the president's not involved. They're just internal rules for the House and internal rules for the Senate. They're not the same thing. What the House passed was an amendment to their rule, which they can do at any time. And it only applies to the House and it only applies to this Congress. And I think this is the best thing about this particular rule, in that it is very, very limited, which I think is the right way to approach this. This is extraordinary times. We got to try something new. That's important. The country can't become wedded to tradition to the point where we don't evolve. But you want to get into this sort of thing kind of cautiously. So the rule change allows for a 45-day window in which remote voting will be allowed, but it is tied specifically to national health emergencies linked to COVID. So this isn't just whenever they want to do it. It's just for now, just for this situation, and just for 45 days, although they can extend that if they want to. And it allows for proxy voting. And what has to happen is a member of the House that does not wish to come to Washington to cast votes can announce in writing to the House that they are going to be voting by proxy. And then they have to name another legislator who will be allowed to vote on their behalf. Any given legislator can vote now for up to 10 people. Their voting intentions have to be put in writing, an email or fax or whatever, but they have to document how they wanted to vote to make sure people are doing the right thing. But then a given legislator will be allowed to vote for 10 people. Hearings and markups will also allowed to be virtual and will allow virtual voting. And all of this goes away on January 1st, or technically whenever the House comes back into session after New Year's, which is usually the second or third of the month. So we're going to have a test, an interesting little experiment. A lot of people, myself included, were concerned about the effect of remote voting on debate in the House and how the House operates, how Congress operates. Now we have a very narrow, very targeted, and very temporary experiment to see what actually happens. And it'll be fascinating to see the effect that this has on the operations of the House. All right. That's my COVID update. Now we have a couple things happening that are, well, they're very exciting, frankly. Out of the news, because the news is almost all COVID these days, but out of the news, some exciting things are happening in Washington that will affect IEEE members and I think affect our country in very positive ways. The first is on nuclear energy. Now, IEEE-USA has been a fan of nuclear energy for a very, very long time. Over a decade ago, we were pushing small modular reactors, a new type of nuclear reactor, to Congress to explain to them how it will work and why it would be preferential to the system we're currently using. Earlier this month, actually it was very late April, the administration adopted a strategy to restore America's nuclear energy leadership, which is a plan for reigniting our domestic nuclear energy industry. The United States used to be a global leader on peaceful nuclear energy, and we've kind of given that up over the years. And we now have a plan for getting it back. The strategy calls for new incentives to enrich uranium, to reprocess spent nuclear fuel, to do additional R&D, and to actually start building nuclear reactors. There's also some language in there in workforce development that we like. Part of that has now been, well, not implemented, but they've started implementing it. The Department of Energy issued or gave, set aside $230 million for 2 new advanced nuclear reactor designs. This is the new generation of nuclear reactors that have been developed in theory. And the Department of Energy now wants actual plans for building 2 of them, and has put aside a sizable chunk of money to make that happen. These new reactors should be smaller, safer, and cheaper than the current nuclear reactors we're using, all of which is important for allowing the public to accept nuclear energy as part of our energy portfolio, and is seen explicitly as the first step towards revitalizing our domestic nuclear energy program. We also got some interesting mixed signals on Yucca Mountain. Yucca Mountain, as you all know, is the facility in Nevada, which is supposed to receive our spent nuclear waste, which is currently stored at nuclear reactors around the country, which is probably not a good idea. The facility is mostly built, but has never been activated because of political opposition from politicians, primarily in Nevada, but others as well. The administration had not included money in this year's budget for reactivating or restarting or getting Yucca ready to start receiving waste, which it has not done. But just a couple days ago, the administration announced that it would start trying to restart Yucca Mountain as a place that we could store nuclear waste, which is probably a necessary precondition to actually revitalizing our nuclear energy industry, all of which we're very excited about. Now this I get very excited about, which is our space policy. There was a meeting on May 19th, excuse me, which I believe was Wednesday of this week, of the National Space Council. Now, this was originally supposed to be a face-to-face meeting, including the Vice President. President Trump has placed Vice President Pence in charge of space policy, and the Vice President has been very active in that area. There was supposed to be a meeting in Cleveland between all of the relevant parties. IEEE-USA was invited to have a seat at the table, which we were excited about filling. That didn't happen, which is unfortunate, but we had a virtual meeting instead, which is the best we can do. What is important about this meeting is it included the cabinet secretary, so the top person at a number of agencies, including NASA, Department of Transportation, Department of Defense, Department of Commerce, Department of Energy. And in all cases, the secretaries were there to talk about commercialized or private space flight and what their agencies were doing to encourage and help facilitate private space flight. Some of the program DOT, has a new accelerated process for approving new spaceports, which is kind of cool. We actually have 12 approved spaceports in this country at the moment, which was more than I thought. There are either 6 or 9, depending on who you talk to, additional facilities that are being considered. DOE has a new Space Advisory Council that includes Norm Augustine and a number of other big heavy hitters. And they were talking about their new small modular reactor research, which could power spacecraft in orbit, which is exciting. DOD is looking at a space power doctrine that would incorporate and empower commercialized spaceflight. All of this is because of a very historic event that is going to happen on May 27th. There will be, fingers crossed, weather permitting, a launch of SpaceX that will put astronauts in space. This represents the very first time a privately owned spacecraft has put people into orbit. This is exciting, and this is a big milestone because that SpaceX launch will be several multiples less money than a traditional NASA launch. It is somewhere in the vicinity of 6 times less to put this person for SpaceX to put someone into orbit than for NASA to do it. And if getting into orbit now costs a couple $100 million instead of several billion, that's a big deal for what is now possible in outer space. We have a couple companies now, private companies, that are capable of building, if the launch goes successfully, capable of building and launching people and satellites into orbit without government funds. And this represents, we think, a real sea change in how the United States and ultimately the world approaches space, and should make space more accessible. So this is a big deal. And IEEE-USA has been supporting commercial space flight for a very long time. It's important to note this process began during the Obama administration. The Trump administration picked it up and ran with it. So this is a bipartisan, there aren't that many policies that remain more or less constant from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. This is one of them, and it's starting to pay off, which is very exciting. Couple bills that I want to bring your attention to. The Advanced Technical Manufacturing Act, introduced by Senator Wicker and Cantwell. Those are the top two people in the Senate committee that's handling this bill. So we have a bipartisan bill, power legislators putting it forward. It reauthorizes and updates the Advanced Technical Education Program, which provides funds to train people to work in STEM fields, particularly not college degrees. Some of the money goes for college degrees, but most of it goes to technical training and community colleges, which is something IEEE-USA supports. The bill itself has poor prospects just because not much is getting through, but we're pushing, and the plan is to attach it to another bill, which does have some potential. The program itself, the Advanced Technical Education Program, is very popular. Community colleges are generally held in reasonably high esteem by Congress. And so we hope that it will get some traction and see the light of day in some other bill before the end of the year. Bit of good news. We talked a few weeks ago about the NSF Director. The Director of the National Science Foundation, her term ended back in March. And so the position has been vacant for a little while, which, for the nation's premier research institution, that's unfortunate in these times. Dr. Sethuraman Panchanthan, sorry, I worked on his name before the talk and I just blanked on it, has been nominated. The good doctor is a very accomplished engineer, and we know that because he is an IEEE fellow. One of the two things that we have to focus on in his bio, he is an IEEE fellow, so we're pleased that he's been nominated for this post, support his nomination, and I'm sure he'll do a great job because he is a fellow. It's also worth noting that on your screen now is his official photograph from his bio, and you'll note that he's wearing a Gryffindor tie. And I think that's something we should encourage in our government officials. He is clearly born for leadership, and we expect great things from him. We've been waiting on a date for the confirmation hearing, and we now have one. It will be June 3rd. The nomination itself is not particularly controversial. It goes before the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, which will approve him or not. We plan on doing some gentle nudging to encourage the Senate to make sure this happens. Like I said, the nomination itself is not terribly controversial. He's well thought of. He has a good reputation around DC and a great record. And of course, is an IEEE fellow. But things happen. And there's always a chance that this nomination can be bumped just because the Senate gets distracted and something else comes up. So we will be spending next week working with IEEE members in key states to nudge senators on that committee to make sure this nomination happens and to make sure they know how much we think of the good doctor. As always, IEEE has a number of resources available online. We're always updating these things to help IEEE members through the current situation. IEEEUSA.org/help has our IEEE-USA resources. The IEEE Foundation is doing a fantastic job collecting contributions for COVID-related projects done by IEEE units. And if you wish to donate to that, there's a link there. And Spectrum has a more exhaustive list of resources globally to help IEEE members through the current pandemic. Our next update will be June 5th. 1 o'clock Eastern, same as normal. At that point, we will be 1 week back from the Memorial Day recess. Hopefully, we'll have a new NSF director, and we'll have a pretty good idea of what's going to be happening over the next month in Congress and the state of the next relief bill. So I hope you'll all join us. I'm Russ Harrison, Director. Oops, bumped my keyboard. Sorry about that. Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA. There's my email address, r.t.harrison@ieee.org. Phone number is 202-530-8326. Please feel free to reach anytime. And with that, I'm going to quickly switch screens here so I can look to see if there are any questions. If you do have questions about anything we talked about or anything we didn't talk about, please put them in your chat screen, and we should be able to get them answered. Nuclear waste disposal. That is not actually part of the consideration at the moment, which is an interesting and important oversight. Obviously, there's going to have, and this is the problem. Before we can do proper disposal of nuclear waste, we need some place to put it. The United States has spent a huge amount of money building a place to put it in Nevada, but the site's not quite done yet. And a decision was made a while ago not to use it. Well, now the administration has said we're going to get Yucca Mountain ready to be used. They have to find money to do that, and then they have to do it. And even after they get it ready, we then have to spend money to ship the waste to it. That hasn't happened yet. What has happened is we started to walk down a path that will allow us to start doing those things, but we're not there yet. And yes, that's an oversight. The other thing that's happening is you can take nuclear waste and reprocess it into nuclear fuel. Now, we haven't done that because when you do that, you produce plutonium, which is what you use in bombs, and we didn't want to do that for non-proliferation purposes. That decision not to reprocess spent fuel was made back in the 1950s when nuclear proliferation was a big concern. Of course, still is a big concern, but the fact is there are nuclear facilities all over the world that are reprocessing waste, and it hasn't been a problem, and they've been handling the plutonium that comes from that responsibly. So there is now a question of whether we can take our nuclear waste, reprocess it, and then basically use it as fuel for energy, because the part of nuclear waste that you don't want is the radioactivity, which is, of course, the energy used to produce electricity. The administration has signaled that they're walking towards that path, although, again, they haven't actually done it yet. And IEEE-USA has supported doing that for a while now. So that's a long way of saying, Lynn, that no, they're not doing it, but they're moving towards it, and we're going to have to, next phase, that will have to be part of it. And I believe there's another one. Language about partnering with allies in this new nuclear energy push, or is this a U.S.-only policy? It is a U.S.-only policy, but again, it's just the first step. I mean, it's about revitalizing the U.S. nuclear energy industry, about hiring Americans into the field and training Americans to work in the field. So it's not really a global policy. One of the purposes of the initiative is to have other countries buy nuclear reactors from us, which we used to do, but got away from it in the last few years as China caught up and was able to build nuclear reactors more cheaply, based in result in some parts of some unfortunate decisions made by Westinghouse, but that's another story entirely. One would expect there to be some cooperation with some of our allies on nuclear industry. Of course, once you start building nuclear reactors, there's non-proliferation and export control concerns that have to be addressed. It's best if you do that in consultation with your allies, but we're not there yet. So that's down the line as well. Jonathan, do we have any other questions? Okay. Again, you have my contact information up on your screen. Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA. My email address again is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. My phone number is 202-530-8326. I want to thank you all for joining me today. Hope you have a wonderful Memorial Day and look forward to speaking with you again in June. Have a good afternoon.